Love is not just for this world. If you want to discover feelings that transcend boundaries, subscribe now. The laboratory on Xyloth 7 pulsed with artificial light, the walls thrumming with a quiet yet constant energy, as if the very architecture were alive. Professor Erhan Demir had spent the past 4 months immersed in the alien technology surrounding him, yet the weight of the unknown still pressed against his mind. His fingers hovered over the sleek console, tracing the glowing symbols etched into the surface, strange, fluid script that pulsed softly in shades of indigo and violet. He had learned to decipher some of it, enough to navigate the lab's complex machinery, but the deeper mysteries of Xylothian biology remained elusive. Until now, before him, under the sterile white glow of the scanning field, an iridescent strand of Xylothian DNA floated within a containment field, shifting and shimmering like liquid metal. It was unlike any genetic material found on Earth. Not fixed, but fluid, as if its very structure responded to external forces. He leaned in, eyes narrowing as he watched the strand pulse in sync with the lab's faint energy hum. This was what he had been sent here to understand: the resonant properties of Xylothian genetics. The air carried a faint metallic tang, laced with something sweet and floral, a byproduct of Xyloth 7's oxygen-rich atmosphere. The lab smelled of science, of sterility and control, yet the scent of the planet always found a way to creep in, a subtle reminder that he was very far from home. Across the room, Zilla watched him with quiet intensity. Her silver irises, reflective like pools of quicksilver, held no emotion, but Erhan had worked with her long enough to recognize the faint flicker of curiosity behind her otherwise impassive expression. She was more than just his research assistant. She was his liaison to this world, an emissary of the High Science Council, tasked with ensuring that no outsider tampered with their species' most sacred biological secrets. That was why she was here, not to help him, to watch him. "You hesitate," she observed, her voice smooth, like a current gliding over polished stones. Erhan didn't look up. "I don't take risks without understanding the consequences." "You are human," she mused, tilting her head slightly, as if re-evaluating him. "Risk is in your nature." He allowed himself a quiet chuckle, but said nothing. Instead, he adjusted the scanner's calibration, his fingers working with practiced precision. This was the culmination of months of work, of sleepless nights, poring over alien genetic sequences, attempting to decode what made Xylothians so biologically unique. Unlike Earth's DNA, which was built on rigid molecular structures, Xylothian genetics operated on frequencies, resonances that fluctuated and adapted in response to external stimuli. It was a symphony of biology, a dance of shifting harmonics that dictated not only their physiology, but also their interpersonal connections. This was the breakthrough he had been searching for. If he could isolate the precise resonance pattern that governed biological attraction, he could unravel one of the greatest evolutionary mysteries in interspecies genetics. What made a species compatible? Was attraction truly chemical? Or was there something more, something woven into the very fabric of biology? He intended to find out. He activated the scanner. The machine hummed in response, a soft, oscillating vibration that sent a ripple through the containment field. At first, everything seemed normal. The DNA strand flickered, adapting to the scanner's probing frequencies. But then something shifted, a pulse. Sharp, unnatural, not an error, but something other. Erhan felt it before he heard it. A low-frequency wave, not audible, yet vibrating through his very bones, leaving a strange weight in his chest. The screen flickered. Numbers scrambled, reconfiguring in nonsensical patterns before stabilizing again. A tremor ran through the room. Not a quake, a response. Zilla stiffened. Her fingers curled slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, but in all the time he had known her, he had never seen her react like this. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice devoid of its usual cool detachment. Erhan's hands flew over the console, analyzing the data, but his body already told him the answer before the machine could. His pulse had quickened. His breath had grown shallow. A warmth spread under his skin. Not feverish, not uncomfortable, but charged, as if the air itself had become a live current against his flesh. Then, a knock. Sharp. Urgent. The lab's entrance slid open before he could move. 3 Xylothian women stepped inside. They were unfamiliar, yet the way they moved, deliberate, synchronized, almost predatory, sent a warning signal flaring in his mind. Xylothians were a reserved species, their culture built on measured distance and restraint. They did not invade personal space, nor did they stare like this. Yet these women, they looked at him as if they had just discovered something precious, something intoxicatingly rare. Their pupils dilated, dark pools widening as they took another step forward in unison. The tallest of the 3, her iridescent skin catching the sterile lab light, inhaled deeply, as if breathing him in. "You are remarkable," she murmured, her voice laced with something Erhun couldn't quite name. Awe, desire, hunger? A chill ran through him. Zilla moved suddenly, stepping between him and the women. Her posture remained neutral, but her stance was tense, defensive in a way he had never seen before. She knew something. Erhen turned back to the scanner, his fingers flying over the data, eyes scanning the results with mounting dread. The frequency had altered. Not the Xylothian DNA, his own. He had not just identified the resonance pattern governing biological attraction. He had broadcasted it. A universal signal, an unintentional genetic beacon, calling out to the very species he had been studying. And now, every Xylothian woman on the planet had heard the call. The door to the laboratory slid open with a quiet hiss, but the silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been. Queen Xyluna stood in the threshold, draped in flowing violet robes that shimmered in the low light, her expression unreadable yet undeniably intense. The subtle glow of her iridescent skin caught the artificial light, casting faint luminescent reflections onto the sleek metallic walls. The moment she stepped inside, the weight of her presence filled the room like a rising tide. Erhun straightened instinctively, the scientist in him observing before reacting. He had studied countless Xylothian cultural records during his time here. Xyluna was not just a ruler, she was a force. Even in stillness, she radiated authority, a controlled power woven into every precise movement. But something was off. Her pupils were wide, swallowing most of the rich amethyst of her irises. The shape of her breathing, the way her fingers twitched against the silken fabric of her robes, subtle but wrong. His presence affected her. The realization clawed at his ribs. She wasn't here as a monarch. She was here because of him. Zilla moved before he could, stepping between them in a way that felt both protective and defiant. She did not bow, did not greet her queen with the expected reverence. Instead, she stood with squared shoulders, chin slightly lifted, a stance of defiance, not submission. "Your Majesty," she said, the title clipped, almost reluctant. "You should not be here." Xyluna regarded Zilla for a long, measured moment before shifting her gaze back to Erhin. Neither should he. The weight of her words settled like a stone. Erhin forced himself to speak, his voice even despite the unease curling in his chest. "I assume you felt it too." Xyluna inhaled sharply, a sound that was almost a shudder. Felt it. She stepped closer, unhurried yet deliberate, her violet robes trailing behind her like liquid dusk. "You make it sound like an inconvenience, Professor Demir. A static charge, a fleeting pulse." Her gaze pinned him in place. "What you unleashed is not a mere sensation. It is a summons." His stomach knotted. He had suspected the consequences were severe, but hearing it from the queen herself made it undeniable. "You misunderstand," he said carefully. "I wasn't trying to manipulate." "Intent is irrelevant," she interrupted. Her voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it, something controlled, restrained. The resonance does not care for intention. It does not ask for permission. Zilla tensed beside him. "If this is true, then you should not be near him, Your Majesty. You should be resisting the pull." Xyluna's gaze flickered, almost imperceptibly, before she turned towards Zilla. And yet here I stand. The room's air thickened. Erhan had spent his career studying alien biology, dissecting the mechanics of attraction, reproduction, genetic compatibility. But this was not science as he understood it. This was not pheromones or subconscious cues. This was something deeper, more primal, a gravitational force written into the very structure of Xylothian life. A frequency that once triggered could not be ignored. His breath came slower now, more controlled, his mind racing through possibilities. What happens next? Xyluna considered him for a long moment. You tell me, scientist, you're the first of your kind to trigger a resonance with an entire species. Have you any idea what that means? He did. He just didn't want to say it. But Xyluna did not intend to wait. Your presence has become an anchor, she continued, stepping closer. It is not merely attraction, not admiration or infatuation. It is a biological imperative. And if you think it can be undone with the push of a button, you are more foolish than I was led to believe. He clenched his jaw. I don't accept that. Xyluna arched a brow, and for the first time, something like amusement flickered across her otherwise impassive face. You reject reality, then? That is a very human trait. Zilla cut in, sharp and unwavering. Then tell us, Queen, if this cannot be undone, will you propose that he remain here, forever bound to this resonance? That he become what? Some planetary consort? Xyluna's expression did not change, but there was something in the silence that followed. Something unsaid. Zilla exhaled sharply. You've considered it. The Queen did not confirm nor deny. Erhan, however, felt the weight of it. This was no longer just a scientific anomaly. This was a political catastrophe waiting to unfold. He had spent years negotiating the delicate balance between exploration and interference, between discovery and respect for the unknown. But this was an entanglement far beyond any ethical protocol. He was a foreigner in this place, and yet, by some cruel twist of fate, he had become indispensable to an entire species. And if Xylothian biology was as absolute as Xyluna suggested, they could no more ignore him than they could ignore their need for air. He was not merely a man. He was a disruption to the natural order. Zilla's voice broke through the thick silence. You must help us fix this. The Queen's gaze flicked toward her. And if it cannot be fixed, the words lingered. Erhan felt them settle deep in his bones. Because for all his brilliance, for all his understanding of genetics, frequencies, and biological harmonics, he did not know the answer. The moment the alarm pierced the tense silence, Erhan knew they were out of time. The low, pulsing sound wasn't just a warning. It was a signal, a ripple through the facility that would spread like wildfire. He imagined the corridors beyond the lab, Xylothian women pausing mid-step, turning toward the sound, drawn to it in the same way they were drawn to him. This wasn't an alarm to them. It was a beacon. Zilla's fingers moved with sharp precision over the console, sealing the doors with a locking sequence. A temporary measure, but a necessary one. They had minutes at best. Queen Xyluna's expression darkened as she turned toward the screen, watching the incoming heat signatures. They were already moving, closing in. They're not thinking logically, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Instinct will override reason. Erhan clenched his jaw. Then we leave. Now. Zilla exhaled sharply. There's an underground research outpost outside the capital, near the polar cliffs. It's shielded from biological resonance. If we can get there, we can contain this. Define shielded, Erhan demanded, already anticipating the flaws in this plan. Zero-frequency environment, Zilla explained, not looking up from the console. No electromagnetic interference, no resonance transmission. Xylothians inside won't feel the pull. Xyluna's gaze sharpened. That facility has been decommissioned for over a decade. It's also the only place on this planet where he won't be an open broadcast signal. Erhan didn't care if the facility was abandoned or condemned. He only cared that it gave him a chance. Fine, he said. How do we get there? Zilla's hands moved fast. There's a sublevel transit tunnel that runs beneath this facility. It hasn't been used in years, but if the system still works, it'll take us within 2 kilometers of the outpost. A deep, metallic groan shuddered through the lab, the doors vibrating from the force of something slamming against them. Erhan's pulse spiked. They were here. Xyluna stepped forward, her expression unreadable as she placed her hand flat against the door. She didn't move, didn't react, just stood there as if feeling the presence of those on the other side. "They won't stop," she said softly. The pounding intensified. A dozen hands, maybe more, striking in rhythm, driven by something deeper than desire or need. Erhan turned sharply. "Zilla, already moving," she snapped. The console beeped once, and a secondary door slid open on the opposite side of the room, revealing a dim passageway leading downward. "This way." Xyluna hesitated only a fraction of a second before following. Erhan brought up the rear, stepping through just as another deafening crash split the air behind them. He didn't look back. The passage was narrow and cold, lined with old conduits and rusting maintenance panels. The stale scent of metal and sealed air filled his lungs as they moved deeper. "How old is this tunnel?" Erhan asked, glancing at the flickering light panels overhead. Zilla didn't slow. 50 years, maybe more. It was used for transporting hazardous materials out of the city before planetary regulations changed. Xyluna glanced around, the dim light casting sharp angles across her face. It was decommissioned for a reason. "And yet, here we are," Zilla muttered. Erhan focused on the path ahead. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls narrowing slightly as they approached a secondary control terminal. It was old tech, manual interface, analog locks. Zilla crouched before it, fingers prying open a panel to expose the wiring. "It should still have emergency power," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "I can override the system, but it'll take a minute." They didn't have a minute. Erhan turned, straining his ears. The sound of pursuit hadn't reached them yet, but it would. Xyluna stepped closer. "Even if we reach this outpost, how do you intend to reverse what has been done?" Erhan exhaled sharply. "I don't know yet." Her gaze was sharp, assessing. "That is not a sufficient answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She didn't look satisfied, but before she could respond, the air shifted. A faint hum, subtle, but unmistakable. Xyluna stilled. Zilla froze mid-motion. Then footsteps. Not running, walking. Steady. Unhurried. Erhan's muscles tensed. This was different. Not the frenzied pounding from a lab. Not the desperate urgency of those drawn to the resonance. This was something else. Xyluna's gaze flicked toward the passage they had come from. Her breath hitched. Erhan had never seen her unnerved. Until now. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. A voice, smooth as glass, drifted through the corridor. "Running, little queen?" Xyluna's face went blank, a mask of absolute control. But Erhan saw the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders squared. Not with defiance, but with preparation. Zilla cursed under her breath. "Not now. Not him." The voice came again, closer this time. "Don't stop on my account." A shadow stretched long against the dim tunnel light. A figure emerged. Tall, unmistakably Xylothian, yet something about him felt wrong. His features were too sharp, his movements too precise, as if everything about him had been calculated rather than natural. His skin bore the same iridescence as the others, but his presence felt like a blade drawn in silence. Xyluna's voice was smooth, but steel lay beneath it. "Lord Kalen." The name meant nothing to Erhan, but Zilla tensed beside him. He didn't need context to know this was a problem. Kalen's gaze flicked over them before settling on Erhan. His pupils expanded slightly, his lips curving into something that was not quite a smile. "Well," he murmured, "I see what all the noise is about." Something in Erhan's stomach turned. The resonance had changed everything, but this was the first time he realized it hadn't just affected the women. Kalen's eyes burned into him. Not with attraction, not with reverence, with calculation. The Xylothian men had felt it too, but their response was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. Erhan didn't move. Neither did Kalen. The air between them felt electric, like two opposing charges meeting at an invisible fault line. The Xylothian lord regarded him with a curious intensity, the kind a hunter might give an unfamiliar prey, not immediately dangerous, but assessing, measuring. Zilla shifted beside him, her posture tense but controlled. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low. Kalen smiled, a slow, knowing thing, as if he found her words amusing. "And yet, here I stand." His gaze flicked toward Xyluna, lingering just long enough to make the silence feel heavier. Urhin watched the queen's expression carefully. She was unreadable, but something about the way she stood, not rigid, but poised, weight evenly distributed, like a warrior anticipating a strike. Told him this was more than an unwelcome encounter. This was a power struggle. "You don't control this," Xyluna said evenly. Kalen tilted his head slightly, the smooth planes of his face betraying no real emotion. "Don't I?" The words were light, almost idle, but the meaning beneath them sharpened like a blade. Urhun exhaled slowly, keeping his voice measured. "What do you want?" Kalen looked at him then, really looked. It wasn't the same as the women who had been drawn to him, wasn't hunger or instinctual need. This was something else entirely. "I want to understand," Kalen said. "You are an anomaly, Professor. A variable introduced into a system that has remained unchanged for millennia." His pupils contracted slightly, the only visible hint that he, too, was not unaffected by Urhin's presence. "But unlike the others, I do not see you as a desire to be fulfilled," Kalen continued. "I see you as something far more valuable. A disruption." Urhun's stomach tightened. "You think this is an opportunity?" Kalen's lips curved faintly. "I think this is the first time the natural order has been rewritten, and I do not believe in accidents." Zilla let out a sharp breath. "If you think you can use this to your advantage." "Of course I can." Kalen's tone was maddeningly composed. "The resonance has always been a biological absolute, an undeniable force that dictates the structure of our civilization. But now, it is malleable, changeable." He gestured toward Urhun. "You are living proof of that." Xyluna's voice was quiet but firm. "You assume too much." Kalen met her gaze, and for the first time, the amusement in his expression faded. "Do I?" A distant sound reverberated through the tunnel, a low, rhythmic pounding. The others were coming. Urhin glanced toward the console, where Zilla had been working. "Are we ready?" She didn't answer immediately, fingers still moving. Faster now, frustration seeping into her movements. "Almost. The power grid is ancient. If I force it too fast, the failsafe will shut the whole thing down." Kalen exhaled lightly, as if disappointed. "Leaving so soon?" Urhun turned back to him. "You have a choice then. Get out of the way, or—" Kalen moved before he finished speaking. Not toward Urhun, but toward Zilla. It was fast. Faster than Urhun could react. Faster than even Xyluna could counter. 1 second, he was standing there utterly composed. The next, he had closed the distance, his hand snapping toward the console's interface. Zilla barely jerked back in time. The power flickered, a pulse running through the outdated system. And for the briefest moment, the tunnel was bathed in flickering shadows. Then a rush of sound. Urhun barely processed what was happening before the doors behind them buckled outward. A wave of bodies surged forward, the force of their impact shaking the walls. Xyluna reacted first. A quick step forward, one hand raised. Not as a weapon, but as a command. "Stop!" For a heartbeat. They hesitated, but only a heartbeat. Then the first Xylothian woman pushed through, her eyes locked onto Urhin as if he were the only thing in the universe. Kalen turned to him, and for the first time, there was something fierce in his expression. "Run!" Urhin didn't need to be told twice. Zilla slammed her fist against the console, forcing the old mechanism to respond. A door at the far end of the tunnel creaked open, slow, too slow. Xyluna was already moving, pulling Urhin with her. "Faster." Zilla gritted her teeth. "Tell that to the 50-year-old system." Another impact hit the tunnel wall. Not the women, but something heavier. A sound that made Urhun's pulse spike. They weren't the only ones coming. Kalen turned slightly, as if he sensed it before anyone else. His expression shifted. Interesting, he murmured. Then he moved, not to follow them, but to intercept. Erhun didn't have time to question it. The door was open. Zilla shoved him forward. Move! The next few seconds blurred. A rush of motion, the pounding of feet, the distant sound of something breaking. Then they were through. Zilla slammed the control panel on the other side, and the door sealed behind them with a final, deafening clang. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Erhun exhaled, pressing a hand to his ribs, his heart still hammering against his chest. What in the hell was that? Zilla didn't answer. Neither did Xyluna. They were both looking at the sealed door, listening. Erhun swallowed hard. Something was still moving on the other side. And whatever it wasn't stopping. The door held, but the sound on the other side didn't fade. A steady, rhythmic impact. Something testing the barrier, pushing, calculating. It wasn't just the mindless pounding of those drawn to Erhun's signal. This was measured, purposeful. Zilla took a slow step back from the console, her silver eyes narrowing. That's not them. Xyluna's posture remained controlled, but her fingers twitched at her sides. No, Erhun's pulse hadn't slowed since they ran. Sweat dampened his collar, his breathing uneven, but his mind was already working. If it's not the women, he said, forcing his voice steady. Then who is it? Zilla didn't look at him. Something worse. Erhun turned to the queen. You knew this was possible. Xyluna exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. I suspected. It wasn't enough of an answer. Erhun stepped closer, lowering his voice. That thing back there, Kalen. He knew something we didn't. Xyluna's gaze met his. There was no denial. You were too focused on the women, she said. But resonance is not exclusive to them. Something heavy settled in Erhun's stomach. You mean the men feel it too? Not in the same way, Xyluna said. For the women, it is compulsion, instinct overriding reason. But for the men, she hesitated just for a fraction of a second. For the men, it is an anomaly. And anomalies are threats. A new kind of dread twisted through him. The women were dangerous because they needed him. But the men, they saw him as something unnatural. A break in their biological certainty. A problem to be solved. Or eliminated. Zilla let out a quiet breath, glancing back at the door. We don't have time for a lesson in evolutionary hierarchy. That thing on the other side is going to find a way through. She turned toward the tunnel ahead, barely illuminated by flickering emergency lights. We need to keep moving. Erhun didn't argue. The corridor sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. The tunnel system beneath the city had been abandoned for decades, but it still carried the weight of its old purpose, a place meant to be forgotten. Zilla moved ahead, fingers skimming the walls as if searching for something. Xyluna's voice was softer when she spoke. You were right about Kalen. Erhun glanced at her. He knew, she continued. He knew before I did. It wasn't an easy admission for her. Erhun could see that in the slight tension in her jaw, the way she didn't quite meet his eyes. Then what does he want? Erhun asked. Xyluna hesitated. Then, from ahead, Zilla's voice broke the silence. There. She stopped at a junction where the tunnel split into two directions. On the wall beside them, a control panel flickered weakly, barely clinging to life. Zilla pressed a sequence into the interface. A door hissed open. Cold air rushed out, carrying the sharp scent of machinery long dormant. Inside was a narrow chamber, no wider than a small transport pod. The walls were lined with outdated tech. Manual switches, analog displays, systems untouched by modern interference. The maintenance shaft, Zilla said. It runs beneath the city, straight to the old outpost. Erhun stepped inside, glancing at the worn-down controls. And you're sure it still works? No, Zilla said, already moving to the console. But we're about to find out. She started the sequence. The machinery groaned in protest, as if waking from a long, unwilling sleep. Erhun turned back to the tunnel. The pounding from before had stopped, but he knew better than to trust the silence. Something was still coming. Xyluna watched the entrance, standing unervingly still. If Kalen reaches us before we leave, it won't be an attack, she said. It will be a conversation. Erhun frowned. And that's worse? Xyluna's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes. The chamber shuddered. A deep mechanical were filling the space. Zilla exhaled in relief. We have power. She moved quickly, resetting the coordinates. This is a drop system, she explained. We won't be piloting it. Once we initiate, it'll drop straight down and follow the old tunnels to the outpost. Erhun didn't love the sound of that, but at this point, options were limited. Zilla locked in the sequence. The chamber lights flickered, then held steady. She turned back. Everyone in. Xyluna stepped inside without hesitation. Erhun followed, but as the doors began to seal, a sound echoed down the tunnel. Not running, not pounding. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Erhun didn't have to turn to know who it was. Kalen's voice carried through the narrowing space just as the door sealed shut. You can't outrun this, Professor. Then they dropped. The force knocked Erhun back against the wall, a rush of weightlessness before the gravity stabilizers kicked in. The world became a blur of motion, steel walls flashing past, the deep hum of the transport vibrating through his bones. He pressed a hand to his chest, forcing himself to breathe. Zilla was at the controls, monitoring the speed. 6 minutes until we reached the outpost. Xyluna had not moved from where she stood, her gaze focused on nothing. Erhun studied her, the way her hands remained loose at her sides, how her expression was too controlled. You didn't expect him to follow, he said. Xyluna exhaled. I expected him to wait. A beat of silence. Then she looked at him. You don't understand what he is. Erhun's pulse slowed. Then explain it to me. Xyluna was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, almost too softly, she said, he was born without resonance. The words didn't land immediately. Erhun frowned. I thought that wasn't possible. Xyluna held his gaze. It isn't. Something cold settled over him. Then what is he? Xyluna's answer was quiet, but absolute. A mistake that learned how to survive. The transport shuddered, slowing. Zilla exhaled sharply. We're here. The doors hissed open, revealing the forgotten depths of the outpost. Cold, dark waiting. And for the first time, Erhun wasn't sure if they had escaped anything at all. The outpost was silent. Not the kind of silence that came with emptiness, but the kind that lingered after something had been abandoned in a hurry. Dust clung to the control panels, the air stale from years of neglect. The walls bore the faint scars of old repairs, as if this place had once been vital, then suddenly wasn't. Erhun stepped out of the transport, his boots making the only sound in the vast chamber. Overhead, dim emergency lights flickered in intervals, casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. Zilla moved to the nearest console, running her fingers over the interface before activating the backup power. A hum filled the air, low and mechanical, bringing the station to a dull, sluggish life. Xyluna lingered near the entrance, gaze sharp, posture composed. She wasn't looking at the outpost itself. She was listening, waiting. Will this hold? Erhun asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Zilla kept her focus on the console. If Kalen has the resources to override a 50-year-old security system, then we were never getting away in the first place. That wasn't an answer. Erhun exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. His body still felt wrong, charged with something beyond adrenaline, like a pressure just beneath his skin. It wasn't pain, but it wasn't comfortable either. The resonance had bound him to this planet, rewired his presence into something that pulled at the Xylothians on an instinctual level. An anomaly, a disruption. And Kalen understood that better than anyone. He turned to Xyluna. Tell me the truth. Why is he different? The queen remained still for a moment longer, then finally shifted her gaze to him. Because he was never meant to exist. The weight of the words settled between them. Zilla glanced up from the console. He was born without resonance. I know that much, Erhun said. What I don't understand is how that makes him this. Xyluna took a slow breath, as if considering how much to say. Then, in a tone that was quieter, measured, she said, For us, resonance is not merely attraction. It is foundation. Our society, our evolution, our survival, it has always been dictated by the natural pull between us. It is how we choose leaders, how we form alliances, how balance is maintained. Her gaze darkened. Kalen was born outside that balance. Unseen, untethered. Erhun frowned. Then how did he survive? Xylona's expression turned unreadable. By learning how to manipulate those who could not resist. A chill moved through Erhun's spine. Kalen hadn't just lived without resonance. He had weaponized his absence of it. While others were drawn by biological imperative, he had remained untouched, a free agent in a world where control had always belonged to nature itself. That was why he had looked at Erhun the way he had. Not as an enemy, not as a rival, but as a variable to be studied. Erhun swallowed hard. You think he wants to control this? He already does, Xylona said. He's been waiting for an opportunity. And you gave him one. Before Erhun could respond, Zilla muttered a curse. Incoming. They turned to the screen. A faint blip on the security grid. 1, then 2, then more. Xylona's fingers curled slightly. How many? Zilla's jaw tightened. More than we can handle. The screen flickered again, and Erhun's stomach dropped. Not because of the growing number of signatures. Because Kalen was already inside. The security feed showed him standing at the entrance to the outpost, alone. No army. No force. Just him. Waiting. Xylona exhaled sharply. He won't fight. Erhun turned to her. How do you know? She met his gaze. Because he doesn't have to. The doors to the outpost shuddered. The security locks weren't breached, but they weren't being tested either. Kalen wasn't trying to break in. He was waiting for them to come to him. Zilla clenched her fists. I hate him. Erhun's pulse pounded in his ears. They couldn't stay here. Options? He asked. Zilla turned away from the screen, already pulling up new systems. There's an external passage, a maintenance tunnel that leads out into the wastelands. But it's a bad plan. Why? Because it only has one exit point. Erhun exhaled slowly. And let me guess, Kalen already knows about it. Zilla didn't answer. She didn't need to. Erhun turned back to the security feed, watching Kalen through the grainy footage. The Xylothian Lord was patient, his posture at ease, as if he had all the time in the world. Maybe he did. Erhun took a step back from the screen. Fine, then let's give him what he wants. Xylona's gaze snapped to him. You cannot be serious. He's not going to leave, Erhun said. We can keep running, keep barricading ourselves inside places that won't hold, or we can face him on our terms. Zilla's hands tightened into fists. Our terms mean nothing to him. Then we changed the rules. A heavy silence followed. Then Xylona stepped forward. If you do this, there is no turning back. Erhun met her gaze. There was never any turning back. Another beat of quiet. Then Zilla sighed, shoving a weapon into his hands. Try not to die. Erhun forced a smirk. I'll do my best. Xylona didn't speak as they moved toward the exit. She didn't have to. The door hissed open, and Kalen was waiting. He smiled as they stepped into the cold. Finally,